Thank you, Betty. I think I'm going to go to some of the things that I was actually thinking about for the previous answer, because I think they are relevant. And that is to in some ways reframe the question and bring the information forward so that it is available for the public and individuals. And I would actually like to say that I don't think I was ever pigeonholed, because I didn't allow myself to be pigeonholed, and I was so different anyway than everyone else in engineering. But how do you bring people along, and how do you tell women's stories, and how do you make sure that we are changing the framework and changing the way we're talking about this issue? And I actually had a discussion this morning at IIT, and one of the things I said was that we really need to make sure that women are nominated for awards. And, for example, I have successfully nominated 2 women now for something called the National Medal of Technology. That's what it was called in '91. It's now called the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. I'm sure that some people in this room have heard of it. I had not heard of those medals. The U.S. equivalent of the Nobel Prize, given by the President of the United States. And in 1991, my nominee was the first woman, the first individual woman to receive the National Medal of Technology. That was Admiral Hopper for the development of the computer compiler, which makes every smartphone, every iPad, every laptop, everything possible for us to do. We need to make sure that women are recognized for their accomplishments. And then also some of the things that we're doing at the National Women's Hall of Fame are curriculum related, which is in fact bringing forth the succession and the next generation. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with something called the Google Cultural Institute. Yes, that Google. They're effectively putting virtual museums online. And so we have 2 exhibits for the National Women's Hall of Fame to date so far that are up and on the Google Cultural Institute. And then Google also has something called a Google Connected Classroom, which is effectively curriculum development for young kids. And the one that I did was for a 5th grade class and an 8th grade class, to tell the stories of great women, to get the students involved in researching and understanding about women's accomplishments. And then the recording of the stories of women through oral histories and through curriculum development, so that we're not losing that information, so that we have the ability to understand and hear the stories from the women themselves as a teaching tool and to build on that succession.
The question of succession.
I'll say a few words about that. I'm in the incredibly privileged position to work with young people. And it's not succession in any sort of official or formal sense, but I think a lot about the work, not just of women's studies, but I mean just the work of feminist contributions to the intellectual imagination, the political imagination, as a kind of intellectual liberation. I mean, that may sound ideal or grandiose, but I really do think it is. And I'm reminded of, some of you may know, a woman named Sandra Bartke. She's a hero of mine. She's a philosopher at UIC. She's emerita. She has this really wonderful understanding of feminist consciousness, and she says feminists are not aware of a different world, or they don't see a different world, they see the same world differently. And that really speaks to me as what it is educators are doing is, you know, endowing students with skills to develop certain habits of mind, to present new horizons of thought to students. And so again, I mean, this isn't a direct answer to the succession question, but it does have to do with training students to contribute to our shared collective understandings of reality. And so if students can learn feminist ways of knowing, feminist ways of seeing the same world differently, asking different questions from women's point of view, then we might have a shot at the social construction of reality being informed by feminists. So I like to think that our students will go on to make those contributions.
So many different ways and levels in which I want to answer this question, but I'm just going to throw out a few. In the day-to-day, how do we ensure succession? I think it's fascinating as an intellectual project, but also as a lived one, how these debates about what is equality, are we there yet, have we come a long way, baby, or just maybe, and what are we fighting for, repeat. We were just talking about this in the elevator up, about the, the cyclical nature. The fact that post-feminist was a term that was coined in, 1919, a year before women won the vote. And Time magazine, just 2 weeks ago, declared feminist as one of the nominees for the word that we should ban in 2014. They've since apologized. You'll be happy. 2015. They've apologized. They realized their errors of their ways after an outcry of response. But that also leads to, I think, to ensure succession and to really move things forward requires a continual cross-generational dialogue. And I think it's so wonderful to look out and see the sea of faces that, the diversity in this room in many different dimensions, but among them, the diversity of age and, who's having this conversation about what is equality, what are we fighting for. I think that there needs to be more of that. In a more tangible day-to-day way, at the Op-Ed Project, we have what we call the mentor-editor pool. And the mentor-editor pool, as a number of people in the room who have gone through the project know, is a pool of journalists, working journalists, who are highly committed to ensuring the mission of changing who narrates the world. And they volunteer their time to mentor-edit people who come through the program after you've gone through the training. So through this kind of mentorship and one-on-one in my coaching practice, through taking what I've known, what I've learned from writing books, from publishing op-eds, from doing TedX, whatever, teaching other people how to do that and bringing people through and providing a kind of chain where this is, it's not secret information how to do this, but it's like passcode information that not everybody knows how to do. So I see succession in terms of ensuring that a wider range of voices will be heard from in these public debates that are shaping opinion and shaping what we read and think and know. That more people see themselves as capable of being those voices and being held up as models of such. And I actually am thinking about coming up with an awards program for the kind of Girl Meets Voice to celebrate those who are stepping through and bringing their voices to a more public stage in the hope that you can't see, how does that go? You can't be what you can't see. Yeah. So I think succession has a lot to do with mentorship and with enacting whatever it is that we want to see in the world by helping others do that too.
I think that the close companion or first cousin to mentoring is modeling. And it has everything to do with what you do and how you carry whatever you're doing that allows you to give the kind of access that's necessary for succession. Not to feel the need to be the only voice in the room, not to get in the door and shut it behind you, which you see very often too, because people get so enamored with being the one. I think it's also generational, because there is a strong tendency in the boomer generation to not open up the doors for the young people because you think you're still young. We value that. We're going to be here, dress here, talking. So why do we need them? We can be them and us. We need to open up, and allow, make room for folks, But we also have to model a boldness for them, because often I see a tendency to be careful. When and to be concerned about, well, can I keep the job and can I do this and that, when we're all about risking, and we have to try to instill the value in taking risks, open up the conversation to understand that the people who you're talking about being your successor have to have an opportunity to be in the now, to be in the conversation, not be relegated to some junior voice that really doesn't have an opportunity. So I think, to be bold and open and speak up wherever the setting, challenge so they can see challenge, be willing to accept challenge from them. Instead of figuring, the assumption that we really know it, and we know what you ought to be doing. And so our form of mentorship is often trying to say to them, this is what you ought to do. This is what you ought to do. This is what we did. And it's what you ought to do. Sort of denying any value in their view. And I think we haven't really prepared bold successors if they don't get any airtime.
Can I add one piece to that in terms of succession? And it's thinking about sort of education, training, upbringing of feminist men as well, as an important part of that succession planning.
Because I think we have to be careful about the way our struggle is being explained now, the way it's being softened. When I was thinking about tonight and Seneca Falls, it took me to Harriet Tubman, to think about her. 93 years, then talking about working for a long time. But, so I went to read something about her, and I wanted to share just some language with the way her thing was described. Said Tubman lived a long life dedicated to helping others. She died in 93, so she was born into servitude. These words are very important, okay? And these words are being, in our textbook, they got whole new names for slavery and all that. So she was born into servitude in 1920 in Maryland. She escaped to Philadelphia and then made her way to Auburn, where she set roots down in an environment conducive to abolishing slavery. An environment conducive to abolishing slavery. So then it said that she, her example, that the lesson in her life is that it's an example of how we deal with conflicting ideas, of taking an easy road or a difficult path. And it can be illuminating to all. Okay, does it get worse? Yes, because it gets to this age-old thing that they always relegate women to how do you look? It says Harriet was a woman of no pretensions. Indeed, a more ordinary specimen of humanity could hardly be found. Okay. This comes from your National Park Service. The person who is giving the tour and explaining to young people the meaning of the life of Harriet Tubman. So I would submit that this thing requires us to be very, very vigilant and always resist this revisionism and this way to try to make things seem like it really wasn't so bad. It just moved to an environment conducive. Stunning.
I really like your attention to language and the way that we describe the struggles, and I think the way in which that understanding of the struggles actually allows us to think about succession rather than the sort of polite, whatever the description is. And I really like your emphasis on boldness, because that is one of the things that's been troubling me as well. And especially in listening to the rollback and the talk about reproductive rights in the US and so on and so forth, and who's in charge of one's own body. And the thing that troubles me with that is that we resort to certain practices to try and introduce some ways to protect our own agency, which I think comes back to some of the other points. And so I'm going to, if you read some of the documents, at least some of the ones that I've been reading from the 19th century, women wrote in very bold ways. And they did not step around speaking about violence against women, speaking about not being a citizen and what that meant. And so I was wondering, is the bold step to continue to sort of ask for legal rights or a declaration of human rights, or is a bold step actually to ask at the level of the Constitution in the U.S. to have women included at the constitutional level, which we are not in the U.S. There's a new campaign.
The language?
That's right. Yes. So, because we chip away at it with legal rights, but then they always find a way to sort of combat that. So, I'm thinking about in reproductive rights, wherever your political beliefs lie. The thing with that is that to institute language and legal protection for the fetus and to start to talk about the fetus as having personhood is in the interest of protection, as if you are not in charge of your own body and the decisions of that. And one of the things that seems apparent to me in recent decades is the way in which the law is being used to erode some of the rights and to do it in the name of protection. What was that? Conducive and whatever. Yes, conducive environment so that you could feel when you step out that somebody else is making sure that there's some protection there for you. Or is it the case that would it make a difference for women to be seen fully as citizens and to have a full say in the law and to actually be able to start to create some of the representations? Is the Constitution an entry point? And then we'll open up.
That is a very tough question. I'll say a few things about it. I certainly can't tackle the whole question. I have really mixed feelings about legislative change as the path. We've had legislative change to desegregate schools. We have segregated schools. Sexual assault is against the law. Sexual assault is rampant. So there's a way in which legislative change, I want to believe that laws will protect me, and yet we see again and again that they don't. At the same time, I think if injustice is systemic, then individuals alone can't subvert. I know it's very, it's in vogue to talk about subversion, and I'm all for it. But an individual can't subvert an institution. They can't. I think even a small subculture can't subvert interlocking institutions that are cooperating in the marginalization of certain people. And so it'll take something big to work against something big. And legislation may be one of those things. But I don't think, if liberation really is about remaking the world, really, legislation will have to be a part of that, but it cannot be all of it.
It's a multi-strategy, clearly, that we need. I'm all for legislation. It's done some pretty decent things. You just have to keep fighting about it. If we look at some of the things that were legislated and the fact that they aren't anymore, you see the consequences of it. Things like affirmative action and so forth, where you see the number of the students of color going down at these institutions, again, cutting off an opportunity for someone. You see the demise of women's studies and African American studies programs. You see the shocking numbers in terms of who gets contracts in city and state and in federal government and all of that. So clearly some legislation and some counting and some keeping score and all of those kinds of things are necessary, but they're certainly not a single strategy. They're not going to do it by themselves. And we find ourselves, as the composition of Congress changes, just continuing to refight these battles over and over again, which is to me part of the message, a luta continua. You know, the struggle continues. It's going to be there, and this notion of winning is not helpful to us.
I have 3 thoughts on this, and the first to pick up a bit of optimism about the impact legislation can have, even when sometimes the legislation has been backed away from. If we look at the Civil Rights Act, if we look at the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, those had disruptive influences.
Yes.
You know, things are not as good as we want them to be, but it is a different place than it was in the 1960s, when a third of African American women were, even with high school and college degrees, were limited to private household work as the only work available to them. So those are changes that have had a long-lasting influence even as we back away from them. There's a recent study in economics, which I'm going to have to cite because it was written by my son, that's called the persistent effects of temporary affirmative action, that shows that firms that once had those contractor affirmative action rules continue to have different employment practices, even long after they stop being contractors. So there is some value in legislation. I also, though, agree, and this is where I'm a little, I look at the political landscape, and I'm not sure I want to open any questions about the Constitution. Yeah. I don't know that I want it rewritten right now. And connected to that, I'm kind of reminded, I remember reading once with Frederick Douglass, who actually opposed early on the 14th Amendment, because he felt that the Constitution should be read differently, as always, providing this kind of equal protection. And so there's a kind of part of me that's lured in that direction as well. So those are sort of 3 responses.
Again, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think, first of all, your son sounds great, and here's to feminist men. May my 5-year-old grow up to be one. I think that, multiple tactics, as Carol has said, there's always needed to be this impulse of change from within and change from without. And in the 60s and 70s, when women here in Chicago, radical women, were debating what should this movement for women's liberation be, there was great controversy about whether it should be a movement, rooted in City Hall or rooted in sexual politics, in the bedroom, right, between women and men in that case. And I think, that more recently, the question of what does change look like from without has really been interrogated on a large stage by the Occupy movement, by the Arab Spring, just by all these kind of forces that make me want to ask a question of what would an Occupy movement look like in the realm, since you brought it up, of women's reproductive rights.
Interesting thoughts.
Interesting thoughts, yes.
The thought that I will add is that the suffrage movement from 1848 to 1920 actually in 1869 split into 2 parties over strategy. Reunited 21 years later in 1890 because there was a realization that every strategy was going to need to be employed and they were going to have to work together, and it still took another 30 years.
Okay, well, I'm starting to feel my age as a boomer, and I want to claim it. So I would love to hear from the other generations in the audience. If you have questions for our speakers, we'll come back to some closing reflections. But I think that you have, as panelists, certainly covered the terrain in the sense that it is not a static concept, equality. It is not something out there hovering that we should just simply sort of grab onto. That there's lots of work to be done in how we talk about it, how we practice it in a daily sense, how we exercise it in our leadership, making sure that when we're leaders, there's another leader in the wings and one behind that person. That's talking about succession. And so I would welcome your comments or questions for me as well. And you might want to come up and use the microphone so everyone can just be brave. Or can we pass it around? Yeah. Can I ask you to do that? Sure. Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. So if you wave your hand.
And I'm going to speak for Betty. I think whoever speaks should at least say their name.
I'm Adrienne Nelson. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And I have a question. Does the case for equality require reparations? Simon Heatley Coates has a wonderful piece in The Atlantic about reparations for the African American community, and he lays out a very convincing case for it. So I'm wondering what place reparations would have within your movements for equality, if any.
We just had Ta-Nehisi Coates at the museum on Thursday night. Yes, well, he's got 2 more engagements coming up in the Chicago area. It's 2 weeks UC and then I think another school, so you can catch it.
He was here a few weeks ago.
Right, and he was in Roosevelt before. That's my Kentucky coming out. And anyway, I'm still waiting on my 40 acres and my mule, and I want interest. I want to get the rate that it would be today. I think we have to talk about what form does that take? How does that happen? Repair is an important thing. Certain people have gotten it historically, But I always look at everything both from the point of view of an African American as well as a woman. And so I'm concerned too that often women have allowed themselves to be used in certain ways in these movements to deny their intent. Particularly with contracting, where wives pretend it's their companies, our sisters or other people, so the men, their families and own these businesses can still get this work. So for anything that we try to enact, there's always a cautionary tale for us as people of color and of women to make sure we get out. How that happens, whether or not there's actual reparations in that sense. I'm not optimistic about it being achieved, but I think it's a wonderful thing to strive for. Because there are an awful lot of things in our movements that we thought we'd never get, and did. Because somebody was bold enough to envision it. Somebody 4 generations into slavery was able to envision freedom, while other people told them it would never happen. So I think we should go for it.
I think there's a lot of potency, too, in simply thinking about what that number is, what the components of it are, even if you don't expect to ever get it. I once did an exercise involving school teachers in the South, black women who were systematically paid according to a different pay scale. And this lasted well into the 60s. So,
yes.
We could actually still identify people who were affected by this. And there's, standard econometric techniques that will allow you to estimate what they should have been paid based on their education and the hours and so on. And you can come up with a number. And I think the more that we can find those examples and come up with a number of what did it mean that women were restricted to being telephone operators instead of telephone linemen and so on, just to have that as part of the discussion.
I want to make a brief comment, too, about the reparations question. I'm teaching a course right now on the family and thinking a lot about how the nuclear family structure, which is kind of our ideal configuration of the economic unit of the family, complicates women's position significantly. So in the question that Coates raises in that piece about the case for reparations for African Americans, he's able to document the systemic and the multi-generational losses as a result of institutions like redlining and so forth. Women, not all, not nearly all, but lots of women live with men. that's unique to a situation of gender oppression that we can't say is true necessarily of, let's say, racial oppression. That the oppressed, in this case the woman, is maybe partnered with someone who is the oppressor. And the capital that unit accrues and wills and that those children receive, but if we imagine the nuclear family, they're going to have a harder time. Women's oppression is somewhat invisible because of the way the family absorbs her oppression. I love the idea of documenting women's pay losses. Mm-hmm. I think that is brilliant, and I think our movement should, we should get some people on that. I think the institution of the family, the heterosexual capitalist nuclear family, is going to make it hard for us to understand women as economically disadvantaged. I'll wrap up, but I want to say, just a few months ago, there was a series in the New York Times about should housework be paid. This debate's been going on for a very, very long time. And I love reading the comments because I'm so interested in the cultural life of feminism. I want to see not only what the journalist says, I want to see what the reader thinks about women's rights. And there were many people who wrote in and they said something like the following. That woman is paid. She lives in a house and has access to a bank account with money she didn't earn. I think that's almost a quote, because I kind of memorized it, because I was like, wow, that's such a succinct crystallization of the problem. And so reparations will be very hard to articulate because of the institution of heterosexual marriage.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
I just want to jump in on one thing and pick up on what Cecilia said about economics. Student debt is one thing that you can look at today. And you can look at if women are accruing the same student debt as men. All right? You pay the same tuition. But when you emerge with that degree, your degrees are not valued the same. And that is where you start to see race and class and gender working, and sexuality, I would say. So I've had my students do some exercises, and I think these are good ones to think about the economics of this, although I have to send them over to the economics department. But the thing is that if you are earning 77 cents of a male dollar on average, okay, and that goes down for African American women, and then it goes down more for Hispanic women, and if that's the case, and you have the same amount of debt, ask yourself how many more years you pay your student debt versus someone else. Ask yourself how many, my students translated this into peppermint patties. And they did all these calculations. I would have to live in an apartment that has X number of square feet fewer than someone else who's earning that much more money. I would have to deny myself these treats. I'd have to go on a peppermint patty budget. But their point was to demonstrate that there are real day-to-day costs in that long-term difference. And that difference is how much longer they would be paying that student loan, how much longer they would be paying anything to sort of get themselves ahead. So we can divorce it from, in some ways, marriage, heterosexual relations. I'm waiting to see how the economics are going to come forward from the gay community. As much as I like rights, I'm very conflicted about the marriage. I don't know if it's liberation or revolution. It's very difficult as a 1970s feminist, unreconstructed, I might say, to have sort of had to provide a critique of the patriarch and to get some freedom around sexuality in the 70s. And now in 2014, I'm supposed to move to the suburbs. So I just think that, yes, there are rights, but it's complicated, and there are two sides to this. But that's one way I would look at the economics question. And it might also be a way to not just think about reparation in terms of what was owned, but what was lost in the larger sense of the United States when we were not all free to build, to create, and to imagine the future. I don't know if that's chime
chime in on that? Should I go to another
I just wanted to pick up on that last point, just to kind of put a little emphasis on it. One of the things that economists actually agree on, of all different stripes, is that a market economy with discrimination is not actually providing the most efficient use of resources. That it's not, it's not putting the resources to produce the best and the highest economic well-being. We disagree about whether there is discrimination. That's what we disagree about. I happen to believe that there is, and it kind of reemphasizes that point that we're not as good as we can be until we address these issues.
All right, so someone else? Another question?
Can you pass this to the next person? Sure. Okay, we're establishing a new rule. Whoever has it, pass it to the next person.
Okay. I'm wondering if you can... Oh, my name is Stuart Anderson. I'm wondering if you can describe, if anybody has thoughts on the role of a feminist male.
The role of
What does our daily practice look like, if anything different from what was described earlier?
Take the children to work with you if you don't have a sitter. I'm saying that because they talk about the practice of what you experience in your workplace, and I've been a boss in a few places, and very often my female staff bring their children to work when it's not take your children to work day, and they always say something happened with, that made this necessary. But the men, they don't take their children to work for that reason. If they both work, but it's the woman that brings the child to work. So I think, if something happens, you take them to work sometimes.
I would just tack on to that. Take paternity leave. I mean, and we're talking
Yes.
about men with children. I don't know if you're, Anyway, I have some thoughts about men and feminism in general, but for those men who are fathers, take paternity leave, because just as there is a mommy tax, there is increasingly a daddy tax. And there is increasingly perception among men, among more corporate particular cultures where men are offered, the few places where they're actually offered paternity leave and are not taking it. It's because of the stigma. So destigmatize men as caregivers in the home. I think that would be a radical step to take in daily practice. But for men who aren't fathers, too, I think it's a really interesting moment for that question, Stuart, right? Because Emma Watson, the UN ambassador for women, just announced the He for She campaign. And there's actually a really interesting column. Two sociologists write for a blog that I oversee. Their column is called Manly Musings, and they've offered kind of a contextualization of that movement and a contemporary questioning of what does it mean to be an ally. So I would direct you and others to that blog, Girl with Pen, at the society pages. Look for Manly Musings, He for She, and there's a whole conversation. It's a hot topic. I think the fact that it's a hot topic and that a lot of people are talking about it, it's signaling something, that your question is not yours alone, and that there are more and more engaged in that question, which I think is great.
What kind of music?
Manly musings.
Manly.
It's a little tongue in
It's kind of
cheek.
close.
I've actually written a blog. I do a Huffington Post blog on He for She, and I have on my LinkedIn profile, I actually have a profile of 10 different men who advocated for women, who demonstrate what some of the actions might be that you're talking about. And in general, they are collaboration and partnership and sponsorship and promotion of women and advancing women and advocating for women. And so that is, in my opinion, what the feminist man looks like, someone who is willing to work with and advance women in the way that Emma Watson describes in He for She.
Other question?
You doing taking the mic?
Alright, so this isn't quite formed out, but throughout thinking about all of this, I've been thinking about my own experiences, and I work a lot with high schoolers. I coach high school robotics team, and I work with middle school math classes, right? And so when I first joined a robotics team when I was a freshman in high school almost 10 years ago, I was one of 2 girls on my team, and one of maybe 15 girls in our competition of 40 teams. Now the teams that I coach up here, it's half women because the girls in the leadership have decided that they're instituting this, we need to have more women in this program, right, which is awesome. But then you see the stats from Fast Company where women are 45% more likely to leave their job in STEM even though they like what they're doing. So for me, working on the ground, it's really hard, at this lower level, right, where I'm getting these high school girls really excited and we're having these conversations about how do you lean in, how do you have those conversations with men, and how do you work in a really male-dominated environment. But what do I do when they get there and I hate it? That's really hard. So I guess it's less theoretical and more what do I tell them, I guess is my question. Or how do we work with that problem?
We had this discussion already today, not you and I. But in a different environment. And it's a very, very difficult question. And what I would say, having spent my now 38-year career in that environment, is that we have to continue to fight those battles. We have, I know that some people get very frustrated with it, but I'm going to go back to the suffragists for a minute because they really are a model for me. And I want you to think about the following. In 1848, they didn't know that it was going to take 72 years until 1920 and the 19th Amendment was ratified. Only one of the people who signed the Declaration of Sentiments was alive in 1920. And she was 90 years old and not able to vote. So that means that everyone that signed that Declaration of Sentiments did it for the next generation. And so my belief is that we have to continue to fight those battles, and we have to put ourselves out, and that it's not necessarily an easy road. But what I will also tell you is that, and this is what I actually really write and say, and I'm just going to do it. I want you each to look up at the ceiling, and I want you to see those lights. And I want you to know that that's what I do. And the sense of satisfaction that comes from that, how do you beat it? Except to tell the stories of great women.
All right, thank you very much. The panel will be here, and there's some material there and some refreshments, but I just have some closing reflections to ask them about it. It's typical these days in the media to do the sort of some variation on the Proust questionnaire, right? Well, I'm imagining Proust is a woman, and we're going to have our feminist variation on that. So I'm just going to ask you to do really quick reflections, all right? Just to bring our panel to a close. And then please do stay, have refreshments. This has been a wonderful conversation. It makes me think that there is hope in a bold sense, underscored, that activism can happen, and that we can get beyond this sort of static or stalled conversation on equality and open up liberation a little bit. So, first, just to go down the line, don't spend too long. What's the quality you love in a feminist?
Courage.
Empathy.
What quality or attribute you love in a feminist?
Oh, I didn't know.
Oh, okay, so boldness.
Persistence.
Questioning.
All right. How might our women leaders be called upon?
Say it again.
How might our women leaders be called upon? Just a couple of words.
The next generation of them should be told they should run and asked to run, because the research shows that more women are hesitant to see themselves as running for elected office.
Use their positions to create greater access for those coming along.
Don't ask for permission.
All right. Which words or phrase are most overused by media when they mention feminism?
Feisty.
Strident.
Oh, wow.
Radical left.
I'm not a feminist, but
Yeah. All right, and let's wrap it up with what do you want to hear when the word feminist comes up in the media?
Imaginative.
Ooh, okay, go ahead.
Imaginative.
Game changers.
Say that again.
Game changers.
Imaginative.
Leaders.
Leaders.
Dedicated to improving human well-being.
Dedicated to improving human well-being.
the future.
The future. Thank you very much.